certificate.
Once defenders of freedom, these individuals now face the gravest judgment. They wore the uniform with pride, swore to protect the United States, and stood on the front lines of war. But today, they stand on a different line, the final one. These are not stories of valor, but of violence, not of battlefield victories, but of crimes so severe the military itself sentenced them to death. In this video, we explore the chilling stories of U.S. military personnel currently on death row. Trained to handle weapons, entrusted with lives and secrets, these service members crossed a line few could imagine. Their actions shocked the nation and betrayed the very oath they once swore. Military justice operates under a separate legal system, with court-martial proceedings and strict codes of conduct. Yet, the death penalty remains one of its most controversial tools. These cases raise powerful questions. How does someone fall so far? What leads a disciplined soldier to commit an unthinkable act? These are not your typical criminals. They were trusted with weapons, with secrets, with lives. Yet now, they wait in military prison, stripped of rank, honor, and soon, life itself. In this video, we'll uncover the stories of those who fell from the heights of service to the depths of death row. We'll examine the crimes, the trials, and the questions that remain. Today, we're looking at United States military personnel currently on death row. Number 1. Timothy Hennis. The chilling tale of Timothy Hennis is a haunting example of a justice system caught in a whirlwind of legal twists and turns, spanning decades and leaving a trail of confusion and questions. In 1985, a brutal triple murder shook the small town of Fayetteville, North Carolina. Catherine Katie Eastburn and her two daughters, Kara and Aaron, were found murdered in their home, and the investigation would lead to one of the most controversial trials in American history. This is the story of how a man, wrongfully convicted and then acquitted, was sent back to death row, not by a civilian court, but by the U.S. military. The Eastburn family, a military family stationed at Pope Air Force Base, seemed like an ordinary, loving family. But that all changed on May 12, 1985. Katie Eastburn, her two daughters Kara and Aaron, and their beloved dog Dixie, vanished without a trace. The grisly scene was discovered when a concerned neighbor entered their home, finding Katie, Kara, and Aaron brutally murdered. Katie had been raped and stabbed 15 times, while her daughters had also been violently attacked. The youngest daughter, Jana, survived but was found in a state of dehydration and shock. The investigation soon turned to Timothy Hennis, a U.S. Army sergeant who had picked up the Eastburn's dog just days before the murders. Hennis was questioned by police after his close resemblance to a composite sketch of the suspect. Despite his denials, circumstantial evidence piled up against him. Witnesses linked him to the scene, and his ATM transactions from the victim's stolen card seemed to seal his fate. In 1986, after a highly publicized trial, Timothy Hennis was convicted of the murders and sentenced to death. However, the story doesn't end there. In 1988, after just 2 years on death row, Hennis's conviction was overturned. The North Carolina Supreme Court ruled that the jury had been unduly influenced by graphic crime scene photos, and Hennis was granted a retrial. In 1989, a new jury found him not guilty, acquitting him of all charges. But this wasn't the end of Hennis's nightmare. In 2006, nearly 2 decades after his acquittal, the case took an astonishing turn. New DNA evidence emerged, linking Hennis to the crime scene. The semen recovered from Katie Eastburn's body was found to be 1.2 quadrillion times more likely to match Hennis than any other individual. Despite the fact that Hennis had already been acquitted, the military could still prosecute him under the dual sovereignty doctrine, which allows for a defendant to be tried separately by state and federal authorities. In 2006, the U.S. Army recalled Hennis to duty and began proceedings for a court-martial. In 2010, Hennis was tried for the murders in a military court. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence as the centerpiece of their case, while the defense suggested that the evidence could have been contaminated. Hennis denied any involvement in the murders, even suggesting that he had never had sexual contact with Katie Eastburn. But despite his defense, The jury found him guilty on all charges, and he was sentenced to death once again. The U.S. military, after decades of legal battles, had brought him back to face justice for crimes he had once been acquitted of. Hennis, now a convicted murderer in the eyes of the military, was sentenced to death by the U.S. Army and imprisoned at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. The case of Timothy Hennis has remained controversial, with legal experts and the public divided over whether the military's decision to retry him violated his constitutional rights. The question remains, should someone, once acquitted, be tried again for the same crime under different legal systems? Hennis's story doesn't just represent one man's fall from grace. It highlights the complex interplay between civilian and military jurisdiction, the power of new evidence, and the troubling possibility of double jeopardy. Sentenced to death once more, Timothy Hennis's case serves as a powerful reminder of the intricate web that is the American legal system and the unforeseen consequences of long-held, unresolved questions of guilt and innocence. Now, as Hennis remains on death row, the debate over his case continues to provoke intense discussions on justice, fairness, and the limits of the law. Will his death sentence stand, or will further appeals bring yet another shocking twist to this real-life legal drama? Only time will tell. Number 2, Ronald Adrien Gray, once a U.S. Army specialist, became one of the most terrifying serial killers in American military history. Born August 14, 1965, Gray's transformation from soldier to sadistic predator left a dark stain on Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Between 1986 and 1987, he committed a string of brutal rapes and murders that shocked the nation and forced the military to confront a killer in its own ranks. Gray grew up in Liberty City, Miami, under harsh conditions. His childhood was marred by poverty, instability, and abuse from a violent stepfather. This toxic environment shaped a disturbed individual who would later inflict unimaginable horror on his victims. In 1984, at the age of 18, Gray enlisted in the U.S. Army and was stationed at Fort Bragg. Despite the structure and discipline of military life, Gray's dark urges spiraled out of control. Over the course of less than a year, he raped and murdered civilians and fellow soldiers alike. His crimes methodical, sadistic, and merciless. His first known victim, 23-year-old Linda Jean Coates, was murdered on April 27, 1986. By the end of that year, he had raped and killed 18-year-old Tammy Cofer Wilson. But Gray's violence didn't stop there. On December 15, 1986, he abducted and brutally murdered Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay. Evidence placed Gray at the scene: fingerprints, stolen weapons, and a witness report. Her decomposed body was later discovered in the woods, riddled with bullets and signs of sexual assault. Then, on January 3, 1987, Gray entered the barracks of Private Mary Ann Lang Namath. He raped and stabbed her, leaving her for dead. Miraculously, Namath survived. Her testimony would later become a crucial part of his conviction. Only 3 days later, he struck again. Gray raped and murdered 23-year-old cab driver Kimberly Ann Ruggles. Her body, found near Fort Bragg, showed signs of rape, sodomy, beating, and multiple stab wounds. Evidence found at the scene, including fingerprints, footprints, and a matching belt gag, directly linked Gray to the murder. Gray was arrested shortly after, and the full extent of his crimes came to light. In November 1987, he pleaded guilty in civilian court to 22 felonies, receiving 8 life sentences. But the military wanted its own justice. In a separate court-martial, Gray was convicted of premeditated murder, rape, robbery, and sodomy. On April 12, 1988, he was sentenced to death, the first active-duty soldier to receive the death penalty since the 1960s. Despite overwhelming evidence, Gray's execution has been repeatedly delayed due to a long series of appeals. In 2008, President George W. Bush authorized his execution, setting the date for December 10th that year. It would have been the first military execution since 1961. But just weeks before the scheduled date, a federal judge granted a stay. Gray's legal team filed motion after motion, arguing mental instability and requesting funds for psychiatric evaluations. Between 1988 and 2018, the case moved through military and civilian courts, with appeals denied at nearly every level. The U.S. Supreme Court ultimately refused to hear his case in 2018, effectively closing the door on any further appeals. To this day, Ronald Gray remains on death row at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He is a living reminder of the evil that can lurk even within the most disciplined institutions. The story of Ronald Gray is not just about one man's descent into darkness. It's a haunting case of how unchecked brutality and hidden trauma can erupt into deadly violence. And it's a sobering reminder that even those sworn to protect can become predators in uniform. Number 3, Major Nidal Malik Hasan. One of the most infamous names on this list is Major Nidal Malik Hasan, whose deadly betrayal shook the nation to its core. Born in Arlington, Virginia in 1970, Hasan was the American son of Palestinian immigrants. He grew up immersed in Islamic teachings, surrounded by family and faith. A quiet, intelligent child, he eventually joined the U.S. Army in 1988 and was later accepted into the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, where he trained to become a military psychiatrist. By 2003, he had earned his medical degree, but red flags had already begun to wave. His colleagues at Walter Reed Army Medical Center described him as socially isolated, with increasingly radical views and behavior that some considered disturbingly anti-American. Despite a string of poor performance evaluations, counseling, and growing concerns about his mental state and ideological leanings, Hasan was promoted to the rank of Major in 2009. Later that year, just weeks before he was due to deploy to Afghanistan, he legally purchased an FN-57 handgun. The world would soon understand why. On November 5, 2009, Fort Hood Army Base in Texas became the scene of the worst mass shooting on a U.S. military installation. Armed and methodical, Hasan opened fire inside a medical processing center, killing 13 people and wounding 32 others. Survivors described scenes of chaos and horror as he targeted unarmed soldiers and civilians with precision. The massacre lasted approximately 10 minutes before Hasan was shot by military police, paralyzing him from the waist down. What made this case even more disturbing was the evidence uncovered afterward. Hasan had been in communication with radical cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, known for his jihadist sermons and ties to al-Qaeda. Though the FBI had monitored their email exchanges months before the attack, they concluded at the time that the content was related to Hasan's academic research. In hindsight, it was a catastrophic oversight. Hasan's own presentation at a military symposium, titled The Quranic Worldview as it Relates to Muslims in the U.S. Military, should have been another glaring warning. In it, he argued that Muslim soldiers should be given conscientious objector status to avoid moral conflict, and ominously hinted at adverse events like espionage or internal attacks if such measures weren't taken. At his 2013 court-martial, Hasan openly admitted to the shootings, stating he had switched sides in what he viewed as a war between Islam and the West. He represented himself during the trial, offered no defense, and expressed no remorse. A military jury unanimously convicted him of 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted premeditated murder, recommending he be sentenced to death. Hasan now sits in solitary confinement at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the only U.S. military prison where executions are carried out. He is one of only a handful of soldiers on military death row, and the first in decades to be sentenced to death for a mass killing. From a once trusted psychiatrist to a convicted mass murderer, Nidal Hasan's name is forever etched into the dark history of military justice. His case is a chilling reminder of how ideology, when left unchecked, can become deadly, even in the ranks of those sworn to protect. Number 4. Hassan Karim Akbar. In the early hours of March 23, 2003, just as the United States launched its invasion of Iraq, a nightmare unfolded, not on the battlefield, but within the American ranks themselves. At Camp Pennsylvania in Kuwait, where the 101st Airborne Division was preparing for combat, one soldier turned against his own. His name was Sergeant Hassan Karim Akbar, born Mark Fidel Cools in 1971. Raised in Watts, Los Angeles, Akbar's early life was marked by instability. His father, a gang member who converted to Islam in prison, changed his surname to Akbar, a name his mother adopted when she too converted and gave to her son. From a young age, Hassan was immersed in a world of religion, discipline, and isolation. He enrolled at the University of California, Davis, in 1988 and graduated 9 years later with degrees in aeronautical and mechanical engineering. A promising student, yes, but also one struggling. He had stopped and restarted school multiple times, failed to receive an ROTC commission, and eventually enlisted in the U.S. Army, buried in debt and emotionally adrift. By 2003, Akbar was a combat engineer stationed at Camp Pennsylvania with the 326th Engineer Battalion. Fellow soldiers described him as aloof, angry, and unstable. He had been demoted and increasingly isolated. In the shadows, Akbar simmered with resentment, fueled by perceived racial and religious harassment and a deep paranoia. At around 1:30 a.m. on March 23rd, under the cover of darkness, Akbar cut the power generator lighting the camp. Then, armed with 4-hand grenades and an M4 rifle, he crept toward the sleeping quarters of his fellow soldiers. One by one, he hurled the grenades into the tents, followed by gunfire in the ensuing chaos. Captain Christopher Seifert was shot in the back. Major Gregory Stone suffered 83 shrapnel wounds. Both died. 14 others were wounded, many while still asleep. Akbar was quickly subdued and arrested. At his 2005 court-martial at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the prosecution argued the attack was premeditated, planned, and written about in Akbar's own chilling diary entries. In one, he wrote, "As soon as I am in Iraq, I'm going to try and kill as many of them as possible." Another read, "I may not have killed any Muslims, but being in the army is the same thing." His defense? Mental illness. Diagnosed with psychiatric problems since adolescence. His attorneys claimed he suffered from paranoia, irrational behavior, and severe sleep disorders. They argued that he felt threatened, alienated, and unable to perform his duties. But the jury, 9 officers and 6 senior enlisted members, saw something else: betrayal. After just 7 hours of deliberation, Akbar was sentenced to death for the murders of Seifert and Stone. His appeals wound through the courts for over a decade. The Army Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the sentence in 2012. The United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces did the same in 2015. And in 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case. Hassan Akbar became the first American soldier since the Vietnam War to be sentenced to death for killing fellow troops during wartime. Today, he remains confined at the United States Disciplinary Barracks, awaiting execution. It wasn't a foreign enemy that night. It was one of their own. And in war, that may be the greatest betrayal of all.